White Rose. Student arrests. In February 1943, Hans Scholl, his sister Sophie, and their friend Christoph Probst were students at the University of Munich. They were members of a small resistance group called the White Rose, which had been producing and distributing leaflets calling on Germans to oppose the Nazi regime. On February 18th, Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of leaflets to the university. They left stacks outside the lecture hall doors. Before leaving, Sophie pushed a remaining pile from a balcony into the atrium below. A custodian saw it happen and held them until the Gestapo arrived. Probst was arrested separately shortly after. 4 days later, on February 22nd, all three were brought before the People's Court in Munich. Judge Roland Freisler presided. The session lasted hours. Freisler was known for using the courtroom as a stage for condemnation rather than deliberation. All three were found guilty of undermining the war effort and sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out the same afternoon at Stadelheim prison. The method was the guillotine. Prison records confirm all three were executed on the day of sentencing. Sophie Scholl was 21 years old, Hans was 24, Christoph Probst was 23, and had 3 young children. The speed of the process was deliberate. From arrest to execution took 4 days. The regime offered no appeal, no delay, and no public acknowledgement beyond what it chose to release. The Gestapo later contacted the Scholl family to inform them of the executions and presented a bill for court costs. Plötzensee, prison hangings. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded in a conference room at Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia. The device had been placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Hitler survived. Within hours, the regime began identifying everyone connected to the plot. The arrests spread quickly. Military officers, civil servants, and officials who had known about or supported the conspiracy were pulled in by the Gestapo. Within days, the first wave of accused was brought before the People's Court under Judge Roland Freisler, the same judge who had presided over the White Rose sentencing months earlier. Trials were brief, defendants were given little opportunity to speak. Verdicts were predetermined. The first 8 conspirators were taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The execution chamber there contained a single iron beam mounted along the ceiling. From it hung 8 meat hooks. The men were hanged using thin cord rather than standard rope. This method did not produce a clean break. Death came slowly. Hitler had ordered the proceedings filmed. A camera crew documented the executions. The footage was reportedly screened for senior Nazi officials. Whether Hitler viewed it personally was not confirmed in public records, but the order to film came directly from him. The killings at Plötzensee did not stop with the first group. Over the months that followed, approximately 200 people were game-overed in connection with the July 20th plot. Some were hanged, others were game-overed by other means. Families of the accused were also arrested under a policy of collective punishment. The executions continued into 1945 as the war neared its end and the regime pursued anyone it considered a threat to its survival. Flossenbürg April hangings. On the morning of April 9th, 1945, 2 men were hanged at Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria. They had no connection to each other by profession. One had spent his career running intelligence networks. The other had spent his life in a church. They died on the same day, at the same camp, 3 weeks before Germany surrendered. Wilhelm Canaris was a former admiral who had served as head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. Behind his official role, he had worked quietly against the regime for years. His connection to the July 20th plot was established during Gestapo investigations. He had been held in custody since 1944. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and theologian who had joined the resistance and maintained contact with those working against Hitler. He too had been implicated through the same network of investigations that followed the failed assassination attempt. Both men were brought to Flossenbürg in the final weeks of the war. The SS conducted proceedings against them in the early hours of April 9th. The process was not a formal trial by conventional standards. Accounts from those present described it as summary in nature. The camp doctor who was present that morning later reported that Bonhoeffer knelt in prayer before he was led to the gallows. That account has been repeated in subsequent historical records and is attributed directly to the doctor's testimony. Both men were hanged. The exact details of Canaris' final moments were not disclosed in the same way. An SS report noted the method used on Canaris involved prolonged procedure, though the precise details remained limited to internal records. Flossenbürg was liberated by American forces on April 23, 1945, 14 days after the hangings. Katyn forest mass killings. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet NKVD carried out one of the most systematically organized mass killings of the Second World War. The victims were Polish. Their total number reached approximately 22,000. They were not soldiers captured in battle. They were military officers, police commanders, lawyers, doctors, engineers, and university professors, the organized leadership class of Polish society. Following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, these men had been held in camps across Soviet territory. In early 1940, an order came from Moscow. The decision to kill them was signed at the highest level of the Soviet government. The process was methodical. Victims were transported in small groups to sites in the Katyn forest near Smolensk and several other locations. They were brought individually into soundproofed rooms or taken to clearings in the forest. Each man was shot once in the base of the skull. Their hands had been bound. They were buried in mass graves. The operation took approximately 6 weeks to complete. When German forces discovered the graves in 1943 and announced what they had found, the Soviet Union denied responsibility and blamed Germany. That position held officially for nearly 50 years. It was not until 1990, under Mikhail Gorbachev, that the Soviet government formally acknowledged the NKVD had carried out the killings. The documentation released after 1990 confirmed the direct chain of command. The order bore the signatures of senior Soviet officials, including Joseph Stalin. For the families of the victims, the acknowledgement came half a century after the graves were found. For decades, the true record had been a controlled lie, maintained across international investigations, war crime proceedings, and official Soviet history. Babi Yar Ravine shootings. In late September 1941, notices appeared across the city of Kiev. They were posted in Ukrainian, Russian, and German. The notices ordered all Jewish residents of the city to report to a designated assembly point on the morning of September 29th. They were told to bring identity documents, money, and warm clothing. The language of the notices gave no indication of what was planned. Tens of thousands came. They were directed on foot toward the outskirts of the city, to a ravine on the northern edge called Babi Yar. As they moved through the route, their belongings were taken, then their documents, then their outer clothing. Groups were moved forward continuously toward the edge of the ravine. The unit responsible was Sonderkommando 4A, operating under Einsatzgruppe C, supported by German police battalions and local collaborators. The shooting was organized and uninterrupted across 2 full days. By the end of September 30th, the official SS operational report recorded 33,771 people killed, men, women, and children. The figure came from the perpetrator's own documentation, submitted as a routine field report. The killings at Babi Yar did not end after those 2 days. The ravine continued to be used as a site for shootings over the following months and years, with Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, and others brought there and killed. In 1943, as Soviet forces advanced westward, the German command ordered the evidence destroyed. Bodies were exhumed from the ravine and burned. The work was carried out by prisoners who were themselves killed when the task was complete. The ravine had been intended to leave no record. The SS operational report ensured one existed anyway. Oradour, Surglain Village Massacre. On June 10, 1944, 4 days after Allied forces landed in Normandy, a regiment of the SS Das Reich Division entered the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane in the Haute-Vienne department. The village had a population of roughly 642 people. It had no strategic military value. No resistance fighters were based there. No weapons cache had been reported. The SS sealed every exit. Soldiers moved through the streets and ordered all inhabitants to gather in the village square. People were told it was a routine identity check. Residents from nearby farms and a group of schoolchildren who happened to be in the village that day were also brought in. Once assembled, the men were separated from the women and children. The men were divided into groups and led into barns and garages around the village perimeter. Inside, the soldiers opened fire. When the shooting stopped, straw and fuel were spread over the bodies and set alight. The women and children, several hundred in total, were taken to the village church. The doors were locked. An incendiary device was placed inside and ignited. When those inside attempted to break through, soldiers positioned outside opened fire. The church burned. 642 people were killed that afternoon. Only a handful survived, escaping through the chaos. After the killings, the soldiers looted the village and burned every building. By evening, Oradour-sur-Glane had been reduced to ruins. The French government later made the decision not to rebuild the village. It was preserved exactly as it was left on June 10, 1944, and designated a permanent memorial site. Of the soldiers involved, a number were tried in French courts in 1953. Sentences were handed down, but most were subsequently released within years of conviction. Malmedy, Belgian POW shooting. On December 17, 1944, German forces launched a major offensive through the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In the opening hours of the advance, Waffen-SS armored units under Kampfgruppe Peiper moved quickly through the Belgian countryside, capturing American soldiers along the way. Near the town of Malmedy, approximately 84 American prisoners of war were assembled in an open field. They had been disarmed. The soldiers were from multiple units captured during the rapid German advance that morning. What happened next was documented through the accounts of survivors and confirmed through post-war legal proceedings. Guards opened fire on the assembled prisoners. The shooting continued until it stopped. Some of the men in the field survived by lying still among the dead. They remained there until German units had moved on, then made their way back to American lines. Their testimony formed the foundation of the prosecution case that followed the war. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, was among the most documented war crimes committed against Western Allied soldiers during the conflict. It drew significant attention precisely because survivors existed to provide direct accounts. After the war, 73 German soldiers were convicted in connection with the killings at a military tribunal held in Dachau in 1946. Death sentences were handed down to a number of those convicted, including Joachim Peiper, the commanding officer of the unit. However, following appeals and reviews, most of the sentences were reduced or commuted entirely. Peiper himself was released from prison in 1956. He settled in France under his own name. In 1976, his house was set on fire. He was found dead inside. The perpetrators were never identified. Nuremberg Nazi leader hangings. On October 16, 1946, 10 men were hanged inside the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison in Germany. They were among the most senior surviving figures of the Nazi regime, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity following the International Military Tribunal that had run since November 1945. The men included Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German Armed Forces High Command, or Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS official to stand trial. The hangings began shortly after 1 in the morning and continued through the early hours. The executioner was United States Army Master Sergeant John C. Woods, who had carried out military hangings previously. His work that night drew immediate scrutiny. Witnesses present, including journalists and military observers, reported that several of the condemned men did not die quickly. The drops were insufficient to produce clean neck fractures. Multiple men were observed still moving after the initial fall. The process for some took considerably longer than it should have. Woods later defended his work in public statements, but the accounts of those present were consistent in describing the proceedings as poorly conducted. Hermann Göring, who had commanded the German Air Force and was among the most prominent defendants, was scheduled to be among those hanged. He did not make it to the gymnasium. Hours before his scheduled time, he was found dead in his cell. He had swallowed a cyanide capsule. How he obtained it was never conclusively established, though investigations were conducted. He had been searched repeatedly throughout his imprisonment. 10 men were game over that night. The 11th had removed himself from the process entirely. The source of the capsule remained unconfirmed in official records.